Welcome everyone. My name is Ertuğ Altınay. I teach in the Faculty of Communication at KHAS University, and I am the principal investigator of the European Research Council funded project Staging National Abjection, Theater and Politics in Turkey and its Diasporas. Thank you all for making the time to join us today for the launch roundtable for the Archiving Popular Culture special issue of Archives and Records, which I co-edited with my very dear colleague and friend, Dr. Olivera Jokić. The roundtable is the first in a series of events we will organize in association with my ERC project, and I'm grateful to KHAS University and the European Commission for their support, and Archives and Records for their collaboration. If you'd like to be notified about our future events, you can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook, or leave your email addresses using the chat function on Zoom. This special issue grew out of our research interests about 2 years ago. Olivera does very exciting work on colonial and post-socialist archives. At the time, I was developing a project on queer archives and the politics of historiography in Turkey. As we regularly discussed our work, Olivera and I realized that even though we studied different geographies and time periods, we shared an interest in the complex relationship between archives and popular culture. In order to explore the theoretical as well as practical questions we had, we decided to edit a special issue, and we immediately realized that we were not alone in our interests. There was an overwhelming interest in the project, and we ended up editing not one, but 2 special issues: Archiving Popular Culture for Archives and Records, which we launched tonight, and Archival Lives of Popular Culture for the Journal of Popular Culture, for which we also plan to have a roundtable next month. Tonight, or for many of you today, each speaker will briefly talk about their essays in the special issue, as well as their broader body of work. At the end, we will take questions from the audience using the chat function. Without further ado, I would like to give the word to Dr. Olivera Jokić, or try to do so because of the spotty internet connection, to give us a brief overview of the special issue. Olivera is an associate professor of English and Gender Studies at John Jay College, City University of New York. She specializes in the 18th century with a focus on the gendered politics of colonialism, Orientalism, and historiography. Currently, Olivera conducts ethnographic research on community archives in former Yugoslavia. Olivera.
Hey everyone, and I hear me. I apologize for not turning the camera on because I'm trying to save the bandwidth for the sound. I am going to everybody again and to profusely for coming up. And what I'd like to say that we are lucky to have all leaders present, especially in light of the geographic range that we were to cover, and very deliberate about the geographic range and number of times we were to include. And this has to do with the nature of our and question popular culture and other things that we were thinking of, and in a way trying to do the and contributors to a range of definitions of what popular might be. And we are, of course, deliberate in geographic because of our primary or motives was globalization of the popular that are meant to those compose and mean and use today, especially we get to think of popular might be in the age of social media, digitization, and at the moment that the political and the public seem to be consumed with things about populism, or that gets populism perceived action from ways that liberal democracy work. And so special issue was designed so as to bring together academic and political considerations of arts and popular culture in light of decades of that has been done sort of intellectually and medically about times, where the combination was the is and kinds of historical documentation and material that can be gathered. Also include the concerned practitioners, that is archivists who are attentive to materiality collection and ideas about what kinds of historiography they're hoping to write and what historiographers might be looking to write now. So again, I have to say that we super happy to have everybody present. And, I want to issue a brief reminder that the special issue of our records is accessible without option. I'm going to put the link in that in a second. Hear from the order in which their articles here in the special issue. So first, present, so to say, our night or the morning, if we're on the east of North, is going to be Katie Land, who is assistant professor at the University of Utah.
Okay, thank you very much, Olivera. Katie Lanning is an assistant professor of English at Wichita State University. Her research and teaching interests include 18th century British media and culture, the history of the book, and crime and convict writing. Her current book project investigates the dynamic reprint market in 18th century Britain. Katie, please. Stop sharing.
Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Can you all hear me okay?
I think so.
Okay, great. I want to start by thanking our wonderful guest editors of Archives and Records, both for guest editing this issue and for organizing our roundtable today. I'm really happy to be here with our other authors to continue to explore the possibilities of popular culture in the archive. And I would add to that possibilities and limitations of popular culture in the archive, because that might better represent my contribution. I approached our topic from a researcher or user's perspective, and I wanted to think about how a scholar of popular culture might use an archive and whether anything gets lost once an object of popular culture is archived. And I take my understanding of the term popular culture not from the concept of popularity, but from populace, that it's about, I think I wrote this in my essay, the way the people, in whatever form or faction they may take, negotiate their own identities, needs, and power through the media that they use. So people being able to use and therefore access objects of popular culture are, for me, foundational elements of what makes something popular culture. So what happens then when such objects are put in a library or an archive, or when they're placed behind a paywall online? Could we say that objects of popular culture become unpopularized once they are distanced in some way from people who use them? So these are the kinds of questions driving my work. And while my essay focuses on the limitations that get placed on the user's experience, and my title slide image here might show you some of those limitations with the image quality of the database I was working with, I thought I'd focus today on thinking about some theories of how we got to this point rather than how I handled it as a researcher. So I study 18th century British literature. Therefore, I decided to apply these questions to a popular culture that was emerging in that time period, the periodical. 18th century periodicals are often linked to the emergence of the public sphere, a sort of activation of civic participation through free conversation and debate. Now, key to this particular popular culture was synthesis, making connections, reading across a few periodicals so you could sit at the coffee house, like in this illustration, and say, well, the Times really thinks the Parliament missed the mark last week, but the Penny Post was all for it. Where do you stand on this, Mr. So-and-so, right? So it's really that reading across periodicals that invites a sense of debate and conversation, and also really importantly, participation. So it's not just the Times versus the Penny Post, but which one do you agree with? Where do you place yourself in this spectrum of opinions? So it's a popular culture really focused on engagement and participation that starts through reading. Now, what I find really fascinating about this particular culture is that it knew its limitations. It understood the limits of synthesis and connection and reading across periodicals, and it kind of set a boundary for itself. Only reading periodicals and never turning from them to engage in discussion or debate was to miss the entire point of this culture. So periodical culture, coffee house culture, whatever we want to call it, it was really invested in the civic value of debate and conversation. And it understood that you can't get there if you never put the newspaper down. In fact, the culture had a term for an obsessive periodical reader who never bothered to contribute to productive conversation. They would call this person a quidnunc. The quidnunc, which means literally what now, what next, was always focused on the next read, to the detriment of civic engagement. Mr. Politic from Henry Fielding's The Coffee House Politician is a quintessential example. So I just want to show you a bit of dialogue from this character. I have had no time to read it yet. I wish you would. I have only read the London Journal, the Country Journal, the Weekly Journal, Applebee's Journal, the British Journal, the British Gazetteer, the Morning Post, the Coffee House Morning Post, the Daily Post Boy, the Daily Journal, the Daily Current, the Gazette, the Evening Post, the London Evening Post, and the St. James's Evening Post. So if you please begin the lying post. Whew, catch my breath. So the joke of the character here is that ridiculous accumulation of titles. And Mr. Politic is skewered by Fielding for making no time for any useful application of any of these readings. He just reads on endlessly. And Fielding is echoing Joseph Addison's famous quidnunc, the upholsterer of Tatler number 155, who was, quote, the greatest newsmonger in our quarter, that he rose before day to read the postman, and that he would take 2 or 3 turns to the other end of the town before his neighbors were up to see if there were any Dutch mails come in. He had a wife and several children, but was much more inquisitive to know what was passed in Poland than in his own family, and was in great pain and anxiety of mind for King Augustus's welfare than that of his nearest relations. So obsessed with reading all the news that's fit to print, maybe even more, the upholsterer misses the forest for the trees, so to speak. He's wanting to read yet another article about the Polish king and misses what's right in front of him, what's really pressing, what needs and could benefit from his direct engagement, and that's his own family. So there's a voraciousness to the quidnunc figure that's often played for humor or irony in the 18th century, but the figure is also interesting to me because it's not just a critique of voraciousness or not knowing your limits, but also of time that could have been better spent. So let me share one more quote with you. And the list grew and grew. Soon as the difficulties accumulated, we felt like Frankensteins. So now, if you know your British literature, you might guess that this isn't another quidnunc speaking, since Frankenstein is in a different time period. But the echo of the quidnunc here is what's interesting to me. This is R.S. Crane and F.B.K. in their census of British newspapers and periodicals from 1620 to 1800. And I just wanted to pause on this quote because it really struck me when I first encountered it. The list grew and grew. Soon as the difficulties accumulated, we felt like Frankensteins. So where in this shift from periodical popular culture to archive did the notion of completeness overtake the notion of use? Crane and Kay were so overwhelmed by the sheer quantity of periodicals to catalog that their project, in their own words, became monstrous and untenable. Now, the central resource today for 18th century periodicals is the Burney Newspapers Collection. This is a digitized database produced by Gale Singage in partnership with the British Library. And like Crane and Kay before it, the Burney database has fallen into the quidnunc's trap of prioritizing completeness over use. From its homepage, it boasts of being, quote, the largest single collection of English news media. And its spokespeople call it, quote, the most comprehensive collection of early English newspapers anywhere in the world. But that's not where this collection started. It started with Reverend Charles Burney collecting the periodicals circulated in his family's coffee house on York Street as material reminders of the vibrant conversations of the day. To identify which of the over 1 million pages of content in this database actually belonged to the original Burney collection would require a visit to the British Library, where a photocopy of Reverend Burney's handwritten table of contents is quietly tucked away. Somewhere in this vast database is a story about 18th century popular culture, a story about a coffee house and its patrons and the things that they read and the debates that they had. But we've again lost the forest for the trees in a quidnunc-like desire for more, and more. So perhaps is now a good time to remind you that of these 1 million pages of content, there are many that are not legible due to image quality issues and not searchable, whether because the OCR has not been captured or because when it has, it's a jumbled mess. So as a researcher, there are many pages I can't read. There are many pages I can't search. So therefore, there are many pages I can't use. So it's the world's largest collection of English news media, but at what cost? There's more to periodicals than collecting them. You have to use them. That was the whole point of the coffeehouse culture that poked fun at quidnuncs and emphasized civic engagement. And I would hope that it would be the point of any popular culture archive today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'd like to finish the presentations first, and then we are going to take the questions for all our presenters. And next is Saygun Gökariksel. Saygun is an assistant professor of sociology at Boğaziçi University, Istanbul. His current research concerns the judicial and political afterlives of the communist era secret police archives in post-socialist Eastern Europe within the context of transitional justice, authoritarian populism, and neoliberal globalization. His writing appeared in online platforms and international academic journals, such as Comparative Studies in Society and History, South Atlantic Quarterly, Dialectical Anthropology, Left East, and Jedalia. He is currently finishing his book manuscript, tentatively titled Moral Autopsy, Searching for Truth in the Communist Era Secret Police Archives. Thank you very much, Saygun.
I need to unmute myself. Hello, hi everyone. Yeah, thank you for your introduction, Ertuğ. It's good to see you all, and thank you, Ertuğ and Olivera, for organizing this roundtable and for their hard, actual editorial work. I also look forward to hearing other authors of this issue. So this is, I think, a great opportunity. Okay, I would like to actually. I unfortunately, I don't really have like the nice images. I wasn't able to put them together, but I will briefly describe the stakes of this article titled Beyond Transparency and the Communist Era Secret Police Archives in Post-Socialist Eastern Europe, and how it actually engages with the question of popular culture. So this this article draws on my anthropological research on the reckoning with the communist past in Poland and Eastern Europe. Research explored the afterlives of the secret police files, tracking the way those files figured in courts, memory institutions, history books, films, performances, biographies, that is the popular cultural life of the police files. So one thing that struck me, and I explored that in the journal article, is the ambivalent attachments and feelings towards the police archives that are widely shared across social groups and classes. Those archives have become the site to envision justice and transparent democracy, but they also have attracted vehement suspicions of treachery and secrecy, especially with respect to their informational content and political instrumentalization. So in the article, I discussed the sources of these ambivalent attachments, what Jacques Derrida called the archive fever, that famously placed the archive at the center of visions of regime change and democratization and the making of sovereign power. So my central quarrel in the article is this: while this archival fever or thrall, the twinned promise and peril of archives, is generally recognized, transitional justice and human rights scholarship and activism often assumes that the archives of repression, the police archives, can be conveniently converted into archives of justice and human rights. That the means of surveillance and repression can be repurposed smoothly as the means of justice and redemption. So basically in the article, I tackle this view, which is widely embraced by archivists, scholars, and activists involved in transitional justice in Eastern Europe and beyond. So I investigate the following puzzle. How have the forms of surveillance and domination become reproduced by the archival practices that claim to dismantle them and pursue justice? How have the police archives become useful tools for nationalist groups in fashioning their authoritarian anti-communist politics of history and memory? So I argue that this nationalist appropriation and reproduction of archival power was partly possible because of the transparency-centered approach to the archives, which makes them allegedly, quote-unquote, convenient means of justice, but also belies the forms of power inscribed into the archives. So popular culture is very important in this respect. It is where different understandings of the archive clash and particular conceptions or meanings of the archives become hegemonic. In the article, I approach the secret police archives popular cultural way in two ways. Popular cultural life in two ways. One is the national memory institutions established in post-socialist Eastern Europe. The other is cultural performances that offer alternative ways of archiving, ways of knowing, feeling, and acting. So based on my fieldwork in Poland, I discuss the Institute of National Remembrance, which is highly influential in history and memory politics. This institution not only runs the police archives, but also organizes cultural events, shapes public education, and prosecute what it calls the crimes against the Polish nation. Thus, it brings together archival, judicial, and pedagogical functions, and has been an inspiration for many other memory institutions across Eastern Europe. With its 11 branches all over the country with more than 2,000 employees, this giant institution seeks to popularize the understanding of the police archives as holding the key to the ultimate transparent truth of the past. Its archival work amounts to what is called revealing the truth, quote unquote, or uncovering what is hidden, the secrets of people's lives. This approach, however, does not deal with the thorny methodological questions or how the files or the police officers that produce those files generate the objects and persons they describe. And let me emphasize that I do not mean that such approach to the archive is a Polish or East European anomaly. This instrumentalist, transparency-centered, positivist approach has specific global, regional, national, theoretical sources, which I discuss in the article, like the post-Cold War era of human rights, ethics, trauma, and transparency ideologies. So while the Institute of National Memory exerts crucial hegemonic force, no hegemony is absolute, as Antonio Gramsci long ago noted. It is fragile and object of contentious struggles. That is how popular cultural practices, in my mind, offer useful insight into the alternative or counter-hegemonic forms of archiving. The second part of the article looks at the cultural productions such as films, theater plays that challenge the dominant transparency-centered instrumentalist archival politics. I specifically focus on the theater play called Files, Teçki, performed by the well-known ex-dissident collective Theater of the Eighth Day. The artists basically read the files compiled on them on the stage dryly, briefly commenting on the events and persons described in the files. This dry reading challenges the aura of secrecy surrounding the files and exposes the artifice of the files, their bureaucratic language that claims to reflect the events and objects as if they really are, By enacting and commenting on the script written for them by the police officers, artists incorporate them as their own historical and testimonial documents. Where the police officers sought betrayal, artists highlighted friendship. Where the officers claimed to decipher hidden messages, the artists, again on the stage, mocked their interpretation and pointed to what the officers missed. So in a word, the police files appeared no longer as transparent sources of evidence owned by the state, but became part of the theater group's own history and archive, which was at once personal and collective. So to sum up, in the article, I try to show that the conversion of police articles into justice archives or archives of human rights is no easy feat. Any repurposing of the archive needs to take into account the archive's specific historical material reality, their involvement in power relations, and their generative force, which is not captured by the transparency-centered positivist approaches and might be even reproduced by them. So popular culture is where conflicting understandings and uses of the archives clash. While the force of the institutional archives cannot be underestimated, I suggest that popular cultural productions offer important possibilities to imagine and perform alternative or counter-hegemonic forms of knowing, feeling, and acting. So I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Saygın. One thing that really excites us about the special issue is that we have been able to incorporate the perspectives of archivists as well. And now we are going to hear from 3 archivists who are doing very exciting work. Christy Lutz has been New Jersey Regional Studies Librarian and Head of Public Services at Rutgers University's Special Collections and University Archives since 2014. Prior, she was Assistant University Archivist for Public Services at the Mudd Manuscript Library, Princeton University. She holds a Master of Arts in American Studies from the University of Maryland, a Master of Library Science from Rutgers University, and a Bachelor of Arts from the University of Georgia. And her scholarship focuses on local music scenes and teaching with popular culture materials. Tara Marjan is the Processing Archivist at Special Collections and University Archives at Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey. She holds master's degrees from Simmons College in History and Library Science with a concentration in archives. Prior to Rutgers, she worked as a cataloger at the Internet Archive and a cookbook librarian for America's Test Kitchen. She is the curator of the New Jersey Beer Collection. Stephanie Crawford was project archivist for the Miriam Shapiro papers at Rutgers Special Collections and University Archives. During her time at Rutgers, she collaborated with Kristin Lutz in creating the New Jersey Regional Zine Collection, which collects zines from the tri-state area. She is currently the archivist at the Metatalk Museum in Waterbury, Connecticut. Thank you so much. Please.
Thank you so much. We're very happy to be here today. And thank you to the special editors, as well as to Sarah Joy for all their work with us and for bringing this wonderful issue to fruition. So we're each speaking very briefly since there's 3 of us, and I'm going to kick it off. And let's go, Tara, if you don't mind going to the first screen. So just a little bit of context and background. Again, we're all, or have been, at Rutgers University Special Collections. This is just since we can't be in person at all, this is just a look at our reading room. Rutgers is the State University of New Jersey. We're a very large university. We're located in New Brunswick, New Jersey, and part of the Rutgers Library System. Tara? Thank you. As a state university, we are charged with collecting broadly on the history and culture of New Jersey dating back to the 17th century. And the Rutgers University Archives documents and collects on the history of the university dating back to its founding in 1766. So as New Jersey Studies librarian, I primarily acquire print and visual material. When I came to Rutgers in 2014, I quickly realized that while New Jersey's great exports, Frank Sinatra and Bruce Springsteen, were pretty well documented in our print materials, New Brunswick's long and very unique place in New Jersey and US music history was scant. So this began not just a drive to collect on the New Brunswick music scene, but a move to enhance our pop culture collecting, especially recent and contemporary material, with an emphasis on DIY and creative work going on throughout the state. Tara? So in the article, I did discuss the history of the New Brunswick music scene, how and what we collect, and challenges, institutional, physical, such as preserving the AV material, a few samples of which you see here, that's in the collection. But I'd like to take this opportunity today to offer some thoughts on a couple of aspects of the music archive that I couldn't have addressed at the time or was not prepared to at the time. And I will just back up a moment and say that New Brunswick has varied music scenes. There's jazz, there's an R&B scene, but it's really best known for its rock, hardcore, punk, very DIY scene, and that's what this archive focuses on. New Brunswick is also unique in that we have a network of literal basements in student housing that are what we call the basement scene. And some well-known US national bands have come out of that scene. So just to kind of put that out there for perspective as well. Tara? So in the Music Archive, we receive materials that hold so much meaning for the donors. This, of course, is not unique to the Music Archive. It's with manuscript collections, very much, people are turning over parts of their lives, parts of their experience to an institutional repository. But there are so many memories attached to music, to albums, to shows, to venues that hold so much meaning for people. Memory and meaning hold intrinsic value when it comes to archival collections. I think it's undeniable. In working with donors and conducting outreach, we see this very much. And I would argue that really the intrinsic value around meaning and memory hold as much value as historic and research value. So in subsequent writing that sort of I was doing at the same time of this article and continue to do, I've been exploring the idea of the affective appraisal in archives. And I would venture to guess that the memory work that archivists and curators have undertaken during the pandemic in working with donors of COVID materials like diaries, face masks, social distancing signs, I think all of this is going to perhaps lead to a greater concern for affective assessments of potential acquisitions and really, as some of us talked about in the issue, really bring a new potential for reshaping our popular culture collections and what we think about as a pop culture collection. And these are, in these images, some patches that one of our donors wore on his denim jacket to shows, and then a guitar that was used by a couple of New Brunswick bands. It's a 1960s Kappa Cobra, if you're into guitars. And you can just see how much use and abuse it's gotten at shows. Tara? I talk some in the article about our musical spaces in New Brunswick. I've always been interested in the spaces of pop culture and how those are documented and remembered. We've collected a good bit of material on probably the most iconic venue in New Brunswick, the Court Tavern. It's gone. Here's an image of the building. The building is there. The venue is sadly gone. It's an 18th century tavern building, and it is, as you can see, surrounded by high rises and all the construction going on in New Brunswick. So we've screened a documentary, poster seen here about the Court Tavern and other long lost venues of New Brunswick. Here's the stage shot of the band, the Screaming Females, who they are donors to the archive. So it's an interior shot of the Court Tavern. And I was happy to see that in January, Bernie Sanders showed up at the Court Tavern. He sort of kicked out the famously curmudgeonly doorman at the Court Tavern and took his space there at the door. So yes, this told me we probably want to start thinking about collecting things like memes and other forms of digital pop culture, which I will say Rutgers, as many other institutions, are really challenged to meet the collecting and preservation needs that are required of collecting of born digital materials. That's a whole nother story. But seeing this meme also made me think, and seeing how popular it was on our social media, how archivists and curators might more actively document physical sites of pop culture in the archive before they're gone. Again, I'm thinking of how many shops, restaurants, and venues we've lost in the pandemic before we even thought about or had a chance to document them. So trying to think about a more proactive approach to pop culture collecting. That's about all the time I have. So I'm passing this along to Tara, and I would be happy to discuss this further later. Thank you.
Thanks, Christy, and thank you to everyone for making this happen today. In my section of the paper, I discussed the New Jersey beer collection, which I curate. The brewing of beer dates back to the ancient Egyptians, but here in New Jersey dates back to the 1600s. Throughout the state's history, there have been a number of breweries, usually within a close proximity to a water supply and a main road. In New Brunswick, where Rutgers University is located, it sits on the Raritan River and was on the King's Highway, which was a road that would take you as far north as Boston, Massachusetts, by way of New York City, or as far south as Charleston, South Carolina, by way of many major cities, including Philadelphia. So this made New Brunswick a natural place for multiple breweries. There have been at least 9 that historians know of. New Jersey has had a great beer history. In 1910, New Jersey was the 7th largest beer industry in the United States, which generated $20 million a year. And the process of canning beer was actually founded here in New Jersey at the Kruger's Brewing Company. Here you can see a pamphlet that was created to explain how to open your can of beer, because this was a new phenomenon for people. But when Prohibition occurred in 1920, which made all production, transport, and sale of alcohol illegal, breweries in New Jersey began to close. And when Prohibition was lifted in 1933, the changes to the state laws made it difficult for breweries to reopen, and actually New Jersey had no breweries of its own. It wasn't until 1994 that beer brewing returned to New Jersey with small breweries called microbreweries, which began opening with a lot of legal restrictions, which kept the number of breweries at the time to about 10 in the state. In 2012, New Jersey changed its laws again, and it opened up the laws to make it a little bit easier, and this was the beginning of the craft beer movement in our state. There are now 128 operating breweries, with another 18 planned to open. The New Jersey beer scene still operates in a very localized market, so their beer is not distributed well outside of the state, or even outside of its general geographic location. So that had me wondering how many of these breweries were going to survive with more breweries opening and their limits of tap handles at bars and restaurants and shelves at liquor stores is continuing to be limited. This was even prior to the pandemic. And now with the current pandemic, I fear how many of these breweries are going to close. So with a rich brewing history in the state of New Jersey and the sudden appearance of all of these new breweries, I realized that there was no one documenting the craft beer movement in the state. In 2016, I decided to start the New Jersey Beer Collection with under the collecting that Rutgers University does to preserve the history of the state of New Jersey. This collection is an attempt to document breweries throughout the New Jersey's history with the emphasis on the current craft beer scene. As Christy just mentioned, it's obviously much easier to collect these materials now while the breweries are still around, rather than trying to find things well after they closed. I'm currently collecting coasters, labels, bottles, tap handles, and any kind of promotional material related to the breweries, some of which you can see here. To do this, I started by reaching out to the breweries and hoped that they would just mail me materials, and some did. But since I wanted to document the scene as a whole, I continued to reach out, but often when I or other colleagues or friends visit breweries, we gather materials and talk about the project. I currently have about 75 current and historic breweries represented. The materials I gather are being preserved for the future for generations to learn from. Everything is being stored in archival boxes and is being kept in temperature and humidity controlled environment. My efforts to get people to learn about the beer project has even gone as far as attending a brewing day at a local brewery that was hosted to teach women how to brew beer. During the event, I was able to talk to the brewery and the other women who were learning to brew about what I'm doing with my work in the archive and how I want to grow the archive to document the New Jersey brewery scene. These pictures show me brewing beer and me with my finished beer a few weeks later. My goal for the future is to continue to obtain records of these breweries, such as business records, correspondences, oral histories, recipes, and photographs to help shape the brewery and in the narrative of the current New Jersey craft beer scene. This project is helping to document this ever-changing beer scene, and I'm excited to see what else we are going to collect moving forward. So I will now pass it on to Stephanie to talk about zines.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Stephanie Crawford, and let's talk about the New Jersey Regional Zine Collection. So first, what are zines? Zines are a kind of do-it-yourself or DIY publication. Zines can be photocopied, stapled, glued, sharpied, hand-drawn, or professionally designed and printed. There are no big book publishers or ISBN numbers or Amazon ebook versions. People who make zines are often, they consider themselves a part of the zine community, and they're often very active in the community. They exchange zines amongst each other. They go to zine festivals where there are lots of tables with zinesters, and they read and collect zines themselves. Zines are ultimately about representation. Who gets to be published, what kinds of stories are published, and whether those people and stories are reflective of a broader lived experience. So these are two zines from the collection, Esther Pearl Watson's Woman House zine and a zine on Audre Lorde. I see the Woman House zine as a kind of an artwork. It's a really creative way to make a zine through clever folding. As you read the zine, it pops open into a house, and you can either kind of have it displayed in this circular format, or as you turn the pages, the roof pops up as you read it. And so the zine is this retelling of a 1970s feminist exhibition that was in a house. And so the zine is a house itself. And then on the other hand, the Audre Lorde zine is a zine that I picked up at a zine festival from a random distribution table. And so I didn't think to ask who it was by when I bought it, but when I got it back to Rutgers, I found that there was no identifying information on it. There's no like great way to make a citation about who made it or when they made it. And the point of this zine is not necessarily to express like a creative thing or to make it into an artwork in and of itself. It's informational dissemination. So the zine is a reprint of an Audre Lorde talk on the use of anger in Black women. So for me, so our zines kind of can vary in type and that kind of thing. Slide, please. So the Rutgers Zine Collection really came about as a way to challenge traditional archival collecting strategies. Back in 2016, I was a project archivist at Rutgers Special Collections and University Archives, or SCUA, I'll probably refer to it as. I worked with the Miriam Shapiro Archive of Women Artists, and I made a casual survey of the types of collections that we had. Out of the 22 individual artist papers, there was only one woman of color and one queer woman represented. And while there were minorities and LGBTQ+ women in other feminist organizations or vertical files, they were very difficult to identify and difficult to describe in a traditional kind of finding aid. So ultimately what we did was we made a list of queer women and or women of color, and in order to be able to ask them to donate their archives to Rutgers in order to help combat this disparity or this gap. But this kind of traditional archival collecting takes years, first of all, just to acquire collections, and then probably years to process, and then additional years to digitize and make accessible. So this is where we started thinking about zines in order to expand representation. And something that I wanted to touch on a little bit more than I did in the article is that choosing to collect zines was also based on potential connections to other collecting areas. Zines are self-publications or alternative publications. And on this slide, you can see examples from other Rutgers archival collections of second wave feminist art alternative or self-publications. So the second wave feminists, while flawed, made their own spaces and produced their own media because they didn't see themselves represented in traditional publishing or in traditional kinds of spaces. But there are other connections as well. Rutgers has a very large artist book collection, and some of our anarchist zines can provide connections to the publications created by the utopian community set up in New Jersey in the early 1900s. So these types of potential connections or conversations really drove our collecting strategies. Slide, please. What kinds of zines does Rutgers collect? We collect zines about feminism, zines that are diary-like in their confessional, zines about women's issues, comics, lists, fanzines, political zines, zines about racism, artistic zines, zines about various forms of abuse. All collecting areas emphasize the voices of queer women and or women of color. And for sake of time, I won't touch on access or descriptions, subject taggings, or really how we developed the collection. While those are all really important to how the collection developed, those themes are well represented in other zine literature. Slide, please. But I did want to touch very briefly, lastly, on outreach. So Kate Eichhorn writes about how activist archival collections like zine collections, or I would argue also all archival collections, need to be activated in the present by archivists and librarians. In the spirit of activating collections, a CUA creates and participates in outreach activities involving zines. So in 2018, the Rutgers art librarian, Megan Lotz, brought her Burn first-year seminar class on play, and they came to visit a CUA. Staff pulled several items for them to look at from the archive, but also on the left, this Untitled Cootie Catcher zine. At the end of the class, students spent time creating their own cootie catchers and sharing their twists on the rules or results of playing the game. And then Rutgers SCUA also creates their own zines for events. For a Wikipedia edit-a-thon, we created a small one-page zine that had instructions for joining the dashboard and finding women artists on Wikipedia to edit. And in the Audre Lorde zine spirit for a Miriam Shapiro event, we created a zine with one of her lesser-known essays on feminist art. These zines offer an opportunity to discuss the zine collection, as people often have questions or want to talk about them. And then I think if I could end on a note about questions and difficulties that these kinds of collecting presents, these kinds of challenges, I think that all three of us have talked about to traditional collecting, outreach, and activating archives is often in addition to all of our other duties as archivists. So there's this kind of tension between wanting to collect more, do more, participate more, but also being able to complete other traditional projects and aspects of our jobs. So I think what this means is kind of open-ended. Do we do more collaborations? Is there a call from higher ups to reprioritize? I think these are all interesting questions that we can think about. But thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I must say that it was also fascinating to hear about the pedagogical possibilities that are embedded in popular culture archives and archiving popular culture. Next, we are going to hear from Anne Pearson-Smith and Ben Pearson-Smith. Anne is senior lecturer and course leader of the Masters in International Fashion Management at Nottingham Trent University, with a background in creative industries and over 25 years of work experience in Asia Pacific, and has published numerous scholarly articles and book chapters on Asian popular culture and fashion studies, and is the co-author of Public Relations in Asia Pacific, Communicating Effectively Across Cultures, John Wiley, 2010. Global Fashion Brands, Style, Luxury, and History, Intellect Books, 2014. Transglobal Fashion Narratives, Clothing Communication, Style Statements, and Brand Storytelling, Intellect Books, 2018. Planet Cosplay, Costume Play, Identity, and Global Fandom, Intellect Books, 2019. And The Fashion Business Reader, Burke Fairchild Publishing, 2019. She's an associate editor of the Journal of Fashion, Style, and Popular Culture, and Journal of Global Fashion Marketing. Ben is a digital archivist at Manchester Metropolitan University. He has a BA in history and a postgraduate diploma in digital curation from Aberystwyth University. Ben has a background in digital and traditional archiving, having worked as a trainee digital archivist in special collections at the Bodleian Libraries. He currently works to actively develop and support research data management and digital preservation at MMU. Thank you very much.
Hi, thank you so much.
Hi, yeah, so I'm, hi everyone, I'm Ben, and this is Anne as well. Big thanks to everyone for making this happen, to Ertuğ and Olivera and everyone else. So I'm going to talk about my co-authored paper, Fashion Archive Further, the critical role of fashion archives in preserving, curating, and narrating fashion. So I'll firstly give a brief overview of the project, cover some of the archival theory related aspects that we're going to cover in the paper. And then Anne will take over and look at the fashion theory related sections of the paper, as well as the case study at the Hong Kong Design Institute. So a brief overview first. The research aimed to contextualize the growing world of fashion archives and to understand them in both theoretical and practical terms through the lenses of archival and fashion theories and practice. The paper considers how fashion items were considered to be perhaps unworthy of placement in museums and archives in the 19th and 20th centuries on account of their of low versus high culture, that these items were left out of the archives and museum collections. The paper then went on to discuss the importance of preserving and accessing fashion archives in the 21st century context. We aimed to encourage the building of holistic multimodal archives that combined and allow for various materials and textual objects to be incorporated into collections, as we believe these aid in contextualizing the lived social experience. And we'll lastly go into detail about a case study that we conducted, which looks at the Hong Kong Design Institute's fashion archive. And this includes interviews with the archival personnel at the Hong Kong Design Institute in Hong Kong. So within archival theory, we look at and flag the kind of debates around the whole, the role of human interest in the formation of archives. We side with obviously more modern arguments that consider the impartiality of the archivist to be somewhat impossible and aim to adopt more postmodernist understanding of archives, one that focuses on the importance of the end user, and then one that embraces the subjectivity and interpretation that come along with that, as we believe that's the most compatible with fashion archives in general. And we also believe that that enables greater accountability as well as a more representative nature of cultural heritage to thrive. We also look at some of the definitions around what archival records are and how these relate to fashion artifacts, and how fashion artifacts can be incorporated into these definitions. We encourage moving away from more what we consider to be more restrictive traditional views of paper-based archives and look towards more modern informational definitions, perhaps like Caroline Williams, who describes archives as having enduring value for a given society in a perceived form. Well, the enduring value of fashion archives can be seen through multiple sort of avenues, including evidential value, historical value, cultural value, heritage value, memory value. So within these broad definitions, I think we can find that things you might find in fashion archives, physical textiles, garments, accessories, and photographs can all be encompassed into that archival definition. So I'll briefly talk about part of the project was looking at making some sense of what's out there. So we looked to map and categorize very loosely what fashion archives are and what categories they could be categorized into. So we found that there were corporate fashion archives, so stuff like Nike and Burberry had these. Heritage fashion archives, perhaps the Yorkshire Fashion Archive could be put here. Academic fashion archives, the Fashion Institute of New York could go in here, and the digital online fashion archives, a new thing. You might have heard of Google's We World Culture project or Europeana. These are kind of the cutting edge, very digital focused and very open access focused. So with the transformation of the archivist from very traditional views of passive custodianism to what we now prefer to see as an active interpreter, we see the framing of the role of what the modern fashion archive has to contend with and the modern fashion archivist has to contend with. The fashion archivist must be proactive, active and reactive when considering the type and purpose of the materials that they collect. And they should also understand the importance of the communities that they endeavor to serve. So one of the case study we look at, the Hong Kong DI that Anne will come on to in a section, we believe reflects many of these aspects and kind of provides a grounding to the theory in more practical routes. So I'm going to pass on to Anne. She'll look at some of the fashion theory aspects and also, that Hong Kong DI case study.
Okay, thank you, Ben. And thank you, Ertuğ and Olivera, for all your hard work in putting this together, and the journal's editors as well for inviting us and sorting this event out. We're very sort of happy to be here. Ben has said a lot, so I will fill in the gaps. I know we don't have much time, but this project really started out of a hermeneutic desire that I had to find a fashion archive in Asia, because I wanted to get into an archive and do some text-based research. And I found that I couldn't, well, there weren't any. There was a gap. It was a culture of disappearance, as Akbar Abbas would say. And when I basically tried to investigate this, I found that these archives were in boxes, in people's garages or in warehouses, government warehouses across Hong Kong, or they're in private collections and therefore inaccessible. But I eventually found an archive. HKDI set up an archive, so I was very heartened by this. And in my current role at NTU, we actually work with HKDI, so there's a strong connect with it. So I'm very sort of happy to have seen that this was one of the first fashion archives in Asia that was put on the map a few years ago. But this absence highlighted, I think, many conflicting perspectives on the value of fashion and popular culture to society, education, and arts. And this sort of this overlooking of the importance of this, and so this really drove our interest. It prompted our investigation into this understanding, and a contested understanding, of why or why not fashion and popular culture and fashion items, along with material and pop culture artifacts and texts, are worthy of preservation and considered worthy of inclusion in archival records, and that space is given to them and resources are allocated to that. So, the marginalization of fashion, and as Ben sort of slightly touched on, as a phenomenon worthy of collection is not new, because, as Ben quite rightly highlighted, fashion has often been associated with shallow pleasures and low, inferior forms of culture. And, at the same time, there's huge irony in this, because fashion lies at the intersection of, sublime achievements and base pleasures. It's intimately connected with embodied human forms and its ability to heighten desire and evoke emotions. And, none of us go around naked. So, we all need this thing called fashion. It also, at the same time, represents social taste, status, and attainment. And, of course, it represents the output of creative labor and crafted design talent, which now are so admired and, championed in the business pages of most newspapers, online or offline. So the postmodern turn in cultural production, as with managing archives, so I felt these were two parallel worlds that were going through this paradigm shift: the world of fashion scholarship, the world of archive and museum scholarship as well, in terms of looking at what was being studied and contained and worthy of being paid attention to. And so now we've seen this sort of this cultural turn, really, that where we are now focusing on pop culture. We're focusing on fashion as part of that, as text worthy of study, in order to understand and make sense of our lives. And of course, this is evident everywhere, including on the educational curriculum. So we focused on this case study, as Ben said, of a government-funded Hong Kong Design Institute Fashion Archive, one of the first, that was set up to serve the needs of an education institution and its new location. It was a sort of newly developed site about 5 years ago. It basically holds 1,500 historical fashion items in a dedicated 360 square meter space. It offers an interactive platform of the collection online, which is ongoing in its development, and it aims to serve its institutional constituents with a wider public brief of attracting thousands of visitors each year in an educational context. This is basically what we focused on. And we use Terry Cook's postmodern four-part paradigm of evidence, memory, identity, and community to decode what the archive was doing and intending to do, given that it was relatively new and quite unique. So in terms of evidence, we found there was a shift from the archivist and the archive as the guardian of text-based content to being mediators of fashion-based materials for educational purposes and also the wider community. Highlighting again how contextual and cultural considerations obviously are evident in an Asian location, and particularly in a post-colonial context such as Hong Kong. Obviously the inherent sensitivities of using records and objects to frame and reframe dominant political narratives, which currently are obviously under contestation. We looked at memory in terms of how that was being represented. The preserving and enhancing of collective memory was a guiding principle of many of the exhibitions that the archive was holding and was taking out into the community, into developing communities which were formerly textile communities, such as Sham Shui Po, and holding and taking outside of the archive a denim exhibition called tying into the International Denim Week. And so that was very successful, but also evoked the memory of Hong Kong as a manufacturing base for textiles from the 1950s. The identity aspect obviously also was very important, representing in this archive the colonial heritage and post-colonial aspects that basically were forming and guiding how the content of the collection was managed. The archivist was very much managing and mindful of this. One very interesting anecdotal story that was told was how in the exhibition, the denim exhibition that was held first of all within the archive before it went out to the community, in one section, the archivist had created a little space of examples of the 1960s and had a cover of the Velvet Underground's LP that Andy Warhol had designed, and the students in decoding that immediately looked at the cover and thought, had seen it on a Uniqlo t-shirt in a recent Uniqlo collection, and were very convinced that Andy Warhol was some cool, trendy designer, and they wanted to know how they could contact him. And so, you had all these issues of identity and education and very interesting engagement. The community aspect also was very strong in terms of taking the archive out to the community, aligned with, I guess, a government push to regenerate and regentrify areas of Hong Kong, particularly old textile communities. So this was also a very nice sort of bridging point that the archive was able to leverage on and still is doing. The role of the archivist as content manager, curator, mediator, educator, event organizer, promoter was very much in evidence here, although highly sort of time was a great resource that had to be managed there. So in conclusion, the unifying themes that emerged from our paper were that, fashion archives such as this one very much reflects change and adaptation in terms of content of records and collections, but also how they're managed and how they are used and engaged with both online and offline. In the Hong Kong context, this foregrounds issues of post-colonial identity management founded on negotiated interpretations of the story of fashion and what it signifies for the fashion producer, worker, and user in the past, present, and future, and particularly in locations that were once production centres for the fashion sector and have moved and shifted to service providers and consumer-based societies. So the role of fashion archives in supporting these intracultural exchanges are very important. And they also sort of hint at the sort of hegemonic colonial impact on local culture and sort of the reclamation of that and the reforming of that in the 21st century. And also the notion that fashion, like archives, should be boundary-less in that sense. So that's where I'll end it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was fascinating. And finally, we'll hear from Sarah Jo Maddox, one of the editors of Archives and Records, the journal of the Archives and Records Association, UK. Sarah Joy has recently started a new position as an audiovisual archivist at the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies in Geneva. Thank you very much.
Thank you. First of all, thank you to KHAS University for hosting this roundtable, and of course to Ertuğ and Olivera for approaching us with the idea of this special issue, and to all of the authors for deciding to publish with us. That's very, we're really excited about the issue, and we're really happy with how it came together. And also thank you to Taylor and Francis for making the articles available for free until the 31st of March. If anyone can't access them for any reason, get in touch with me or someone, and we'll try and sort it out. Yeah. I just wanted to draw maybe some themes together from what we've talked about, and maybe start to raise some questions that hopefully we will have time to discuss about the issue, because there was a lot of variety in the papers and in the authors, which is great, but there were some shared some commonalities as well. So I think all the articles challenged the meanings of popular culture and archive and what the phrase could mean. And it made me think that maybe we need to start challenging the meaning of research and what access to the archives means, and why people access the archives, and in what form and what kind of engagement we can provide, especially with some of these unique collections and atypical collections, perhaps. So some of the shared themes that came across to me in the articles are the importance of place to all of the collections, and how the geographical place where the archives were created mean something and help you to interpret them. And that while a lot of the time we think of digitization as enabling access, because people can access them from all over the world, that also removes them from that geographical place. And so that removes a layer of meaning. And Katie's article demonstrated most clearly how if digitization is not done well, then it does not help access at all. And then Ben touched on this as well, and the physicality of the actual objects is important. So when you digitize it, you lose that as well. I think all the articles also demonstrated how popular culture archives have to fight for resources, and they have to justify themselves perhaps more than other archives. And yet at the same time, all the articles demonstrated how important they are in terms of providing justice, and in terms of providing validation for communities. And I think it was one of the Rutgers authors who mentioned the notion of allowing people to see themselves in the collections. And some of the articles also touched on the idea of sponsorship, and popular culture archives perhaps lend themselves better to that. And that's something that I think the museum world has started to explore, and the archive world has not yet. And there are all sorts of issues that need to be considered if people do decide to go down that route. But it's perhaps something that, again, yeah, popular culture archives can lead the way on, perhaps. But also, as well as at the same time as having to justify collecting these unique forms of archive, it also seems like it's harder. There's a lot more work involved. There's more work involved in collecting the items, so you have to build relationships with the communities, with the creators, and you have to sustain those relationships, and you have to be very reactive to events that are going on. And then there's the physical challenge of actually preserving this broad range of material. And then there's also an increased pressure, I think, on providing access and making that turn around quite quickly, because if you need to justify to the creators why you are taking in the material, then you need to enable people to access them. And I think there's an interesting comparison that can be made with the growing community archives movement, which is about leaving the archives in the community and just providing guidance, because they belong to that community. And so if we are deciding that, no, actually this collection belongs in an institution because, for instance, we can provide wider access or we can look after it better, then we need to make sure that we are providing that access and providing that looking after them better. I don't want to take up more time than that because I want to allow time for discussions. So maybe that can be the starting point. Some of those questions can be the starting point, but I'll hand back over to Ertuğ. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah Joy. This was genuinely very helpful. Thank you. Any questions? We still have a few minutes for questions. No questions?
Thank you for all the presentations. For the participants, you can write your questions in the chat. You can address your questions to panelists only or panelists and attendees. Please feel free to write your comments and questions.
If there are no questions, I have one, and maybe we can close with that if we don't receive any questions. Would anyone like to talk about how their upcoming work builds on these projects? Like, where are these projects going now? What are you now working on, especially given the changing context in which, like the radical change in the context in which we work and produce and create and collect? Please, Chris.
Yeah, at Rutgers, like with so many other institutions, we've, as I mentioned, sort of started to try to move into documenting COVID-19 and the pandemic and how New Jersey communities and our students and faculty and staff at Rutgers have experienced the pandemic. I will say that we have faced some collecting challenges, technical challenges, but also actually having people respond and want to donate things. And this is an area where we want to tread very carefully and ethically. So some of our colleagues around the state have done very well. I think especially museums and smaller archives seem to have done really well with local community COVID collecting, but at Rutgers it's been a bigger challenge, although some of us have also worked with a university-wide faculty group as well to bring in student reflections on the pandemic. And we have been able to take those pieces in electronically. We're not sure where those are going to live or where we're going to go with those, but we do have some that we've collected. Just a little bit, movement into that realm of collecting.
And just to add to that, I will also say that I've also had an increased interest in the beer collection because people are cleaning out their homes. Everyone's home, so they're finding things and they don't want to throw them away and they want to find a place for them to go. And so it's also been an interesting time to reach out to donors. And while we can't physically take them in yet because we're not in the buildings per se, people are thinking about how they're going to save these materials moving forward.
That is very interesting. Thank you so much. Oh, okay, there are questions now. So the first one is relating to different cultural archival methods, traditions. What kind of unconventional approaches you favor more, if any? Any unconventional approaches? Only legal things, please. We are recording.
So I don't say anything then, Ertuğ.
Please go ahead, Saygın.
Actually, it is also, like, in relation to this question, it is also helpful to hear Sarah Joy wrapping up these different forms of archives we've been talking about. And nice to see you, Sarah Joy, by the way. We have been in touch, but I never really, this is the first time I'm seeing you. And like my sort of archive seems to be a bit different than the rest of the papers, as far as I can tell. The police archives and the surveillance and repression and the the history of violence and its appropriation, then its circulation in popular culture, that it's very, very kind of archival wars or memory wars involved in it. So it's a lot of tension built in it. So while actually listening to you, I was a little bit jealous of you that, you know, I have a kind of this type of a bit, what's that? A bit kind of this sort of very, very tense, you know, like the story of appropriation, reappropriation, and so on and so forth. In terms of these unconventional approaches, and this is related to the access to the archives too, and how actually it sort of defines the kind of space or practice that we are dealing with as archive. The police archives, of course, is very much guarded. It's based on restriction, public restriction to the public, you know, access to the archive. So I never really see the stacks, and this was the point, right? A lot of security checks you hardly get into, and the building itself must intimidate the user, because always the display of power that this is an important location, and it's not a user-friendly location at all. But the thing is that through these, you know, theater performances or exhibitions, those who can access to the files compiled on them, then sort of try to, how shall I put it, like to try to create a kind of a different, you know, history of intimacy, or an alternative actually reading. They give an alternative reading to those files by recontextualizing it in the present time, but also rewriting that memory, which is not really in the files and which the police officers did not know about, or the informers did not know about it. So this sort of more creative appropriation of the archives and producing another type of an archive for themselves is, to me, whether this is an archive of feelings or archive of, you know, different attachments, to me, it was something kind of unconventional or creative, or at least it really contrasted with the kind of like the police archives, which present itself as the ministry of truth, right? The truth and the whole truth. This is the claim, where everyone is kind of interpolated in different ways. So that will be kind of like my answer. And the people that I find very stimulating, like Laurent Berland, is like a very, very, I think, very stimulating thinker to think about, you know, these documents and their affective ideological ordering of the world and relationships. Or Jacques Rancière, of course, the distribution of the sensible, of the world, what is knowable, visible, audible. So, you know, like all things are, I think, allow some space to think about the archive in different ways.
Thank you so much, Saigam. If there are no other answers, we can move on to the next question.
To add, I sort of agree with all that, and I was very inspired when I was in Hong Kong by the Occupy Central Archive, which was set up by the protesters post the protest, and obviously has now gone underground. It was set up in somebody's living room in a flat, and you know, has also been documented on. It's also been digitized, I believe, but again has to be protected. But I love it. Just is an extreme example, I guess. But this idea, I think, of what is an archive? Do we redefine an archive in the 21st century in digital domains? How democratized can we be about this? Do we all really? Are all our lives archived in different ways from a sort of social perspective, and you know, and sort of taking, you know, the guardianship away from institutions, and decolonizing and decentering archives within communities and globally is what I would like to see happen. And I say the Occupy Central example in Hong Kong is a very good example of that, or social protest archives for the future.
Thank you so much. Anyone else? Okay, Katie, there was a question for you. Which, how are you approaching the notion of materiality in your work?
Yeah, it's a great question, because materiality is so much of the story of the Bernie database. And this weird paradox of losing a sense of materiality, but also residual materiality. So the collection started as a collection of periodicals. Those periodicals were eventually perceived to be too fragile to continue using. So a set of microfilm was produced, and then that microfilm was considered too fragile to continue using. So the digitization was produced. And what's interesting to me is that the digitization was of the microfilm and not the periodical itself. So you have this sort of secondhand mediation of the material that leaves echoes not of, you know, fingerprints on the newspaper or the worn edges of the paper, but ink smudges on the microfilm and fading in the photography of the film. And so it's I think a really different experience of materiality when you're looking at those digitizations, to think about, well, I'm looking at microfilm and not the periodical. And this is kind of part of my argument, or the thoughts anyway, on, you know, completeness versus use, is that a lot of these decisions were made because they've created this vast collection that is then, you know, not really conducive to taking a photograph of every single piece of paper, but maybe we can roll that microfilm through the scanner. So I think materiality is really important to the story of that archive and to its limitations. And I like to dream of an archive that went back to taking photographs of the original periodical instead of the microfilm. So good question.
Thank you so much. There is, oh, please.
Can I just jump on that from the archivist side? I find that really fascinating, Katie. And I think as archivists, we often struggle with the fact that so much digitization is done from the microfilm. We have a huge New Jersey digital newspaper project going on now, and it's all being done from the microfilm. But, you know, we're trying to provide really good service to our researchers. And sometimes, you know, they get very excited something is digitized or scanned and it's terrible. So I really kind of took to heart what you were saying there about that. And also, I think some of us as archivists also fight that notion of completeness over usability. And I had written down that, you know, it makes me think of, you know, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. You know, we want to make our collections accessible in the best, most meaningful way for researchers. And I'm really thinking about what you said about digitization and how that can hamper that. So thanks.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And there's a question for Anne and Ben. Could you touch on fashion archives and exploitation, and if you feel that fashion archives will be limited by corporations and fashion houses who may act to protect reputation? How can fashion and the material culture be contextualized without the records that document their creation? Do you feel this is important, and should that material be part of the collections?
Yeah, thank you for that question. What a great question, and one that we touched on in the paper, because it is obviously a hotly debated within fashion museology, definitely. And, you know, the populist displays of fashion that have been accused of commercial sponsorship support or focusing on the glamour and glitz of fashion and rather than more serious aspects. So, I mean, I think, again, that debate, again, I think, as we said in the paper, highlights the sort of low culture, high culture debate about fashion and where we locate it, and its grubby associations with commercialism. But, you know, at the end of the day, as I said earlier, can we divorce it from that? And maybe we sort of, you know, a fashion archive should maybe map and document all of those intersections. That fashion obviously is an industry. It's always desperate to be recognized as an art form, and it is that too. But, you know, I guess my question is there any problem? We talked about this earlier about sponsorship. You know, if public sector archives or even educational archives are so sort of hampered by lack of resources, what does sponsorship do? This is and who is the sponsor? I suppose at the end of the day, like all decisions on this, whenever you're doing sponsorship or you're involving support from commerce, you have to be very careful. You have to, so that maybe is the role of the archivist and curator, if we're putting it in a museum context, to evaluate who is relevant and who isn't. There's always a risk, of course, with association with any commercial source or enterprise. because things happen, crises happen, they can be associated with the wrong sort of issues. And so then by association and borrowed interest, the archive will be associated with that too. But I think some risks have to be taken. At the end of the day, you know, the commercial side of things has to be used in context. I think it's got to be used carefully. I personally don't see any major problem with it if it's handled properly. And if you see the archive as a non-commercial space necessarily, and yet you could argue, well, the V&A, you know, bounced back and rescued itself financially over 20 years ago by basically, you know, having a cafe and having sponsorship and, you know, bringing itself into the 20th and 21st century. So, I mean, these are hot debates that won't go away. I have no problem with it as long as it's carefully managed, I think, is at the end of the day. Plus, in any fashion collection, you can also represent equally a variety of different commercial design examples. I guess that's another way of doing it if you want to sort of curate your archive in that particular way for equality and equal representation. But obviously it is a hot debate that will not go away, but it can be justified, I personally feel.
Thank you so much. Actually, there's one more question for Anna and Ben. In HKDI's case, has their identity as a formal institution and in some way association to the government impacted how they engage with the community? Especially given the tensions and distrust in society, both historical and more contemporary, or has their formal identity made it easier for them to connect with the community?
I think the latter, simply because, you know, again, in Asia, absolutely in an Asian context, education institutions are very respected and education is very valued. So we've got a different value system operating. And I do think that education institutions are honest brokers in all of this. And I think their remit is sort of apolitical in many ways and has to be. And so the story that they were telling in terms of the Hong Kong Design Archive represents both Hong Kong's history, its colonial history. It contained images and material objects that represented its colonial past, its current existence. It contained historical costume and in addition to Hong Kong designers who had donated their own collections. So, you know, I felt it's very positively received, I think. And I think, honestly, focusing on community and the human story, which is really what the archive were doing in taking it out to the community, such as Sham Shui Po, and having denim days, which are very unifying for everybody. Everybody has a denim story to tell. Everybody has some sort of connection with it. I think it sort of, it puts things in perspective. It focuses on what we should be focusing on, which is the human connection and the unification of interest in a community, which I think is quite successful, has been to this point. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Any final questions? I guess not. So once again, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Sarah Joy. Thank you, Olivera, for your collaboration. It was a wonderful experience to be co-editing the special issue with Olivera, and we are grateful for Sarah Joy's support and the journal's support. It was great to be working with such amazing authors. Thank you very much for your essays, and thank you, Jale, for hosting this event, and thank you everyone for being with us today or tonight, whatever the time is for you. Thank you.